Well, Parker, I think we need to baptize you again next week. You know how to pack a puke and walk. Smile, Parker. That's better. Well, I have an incredible task today. You know the story well, but I have the tremendous privilege of once again reminding you of the story of how the story should end. And here's the way the story should go. And here's my monumental task. I am here to convince you that you are more than you are, not because of who you are, but because of whose you are. And because of that, you should be able to go out of this place and do exceedingly abundantly more than you can ever ask or think, according to His power, Christ's power, at work in you. And then the story continues that in your calling alongside of God, and this is the big idea that we're going to work toward this morning, that God prepares and equips us for every part of His plan for our lives. What I'm hoping you're going to take away from here today is you're going to come out of this and you're going to be reminded that we serve a very active God. That He is always busy. He is always moving and shaking things in this world. And His desire is to shake you and to shake me out of whatever we're in that doesn't belong to Him or is not a part of His plan for our lives. And I get it. I mean, I'm a human being. I came into this thing late. I sat in the pews for 40 years and listened to somebody try and convince me that I could go much farther than who I was and accomplish more than I could ever imagine if I would stay connected to the Bible. And so having said all that, here's my task this morning. I have to convince you this morning that you are God's Moses. And you hear the famous name of Moses and you think, who can compare to Moses? Well, I'm here to tell you this morning that the Spirit of the living God did not indwell Moses. Moses trusted God. Moses had faith. And the Spirit of God came alongside of Moses and encouraged him and helped him. But you have something even greater than that. The Spirit of the living Christ has come to indwell you as His person, of His church, in your life. And so this morning I want to look at Genesis chapter 3. And I want us to come away with an understanding, Exodus chapter 3, with an understanding that God is at work in mine and your life. Our problem is that we fail to identify that so much of the time. We think, well, sure, he's working in the world and he's worked in Billy's life and all those other people's lives. And of course, they are much more qualified for that. And so I'm just kind of hanging out in this thing and it's good, and I just want to love Jesus, and I'm going to come to church, and I'm going to try and do some good things and tithe and encourage other Christians around me. Well, that's a wonderful thing. But we fail to realize that the same God who came to Moses is the same God who comes to us. And we fail to identify how this God works in mine and your life. Well, He works in mine and your life the same way He works in Moses' life. And so in Exodus chapter 3, we read that Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. And I hope you understand that that the angel of the Lord is a epiphany. It's a Christ appearing in person, and a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he, Moses, looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush was not burned. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Do you remember another place in the Bible, in Joshua, where you've heard that before? Joshua and the children of Israel are just getting ready to start their conquer of the Canaan, the promised land. And they're getting ready for this battle. And Joshua looks up and there's somebody standing out there with a sword in his hand. And Joshua says, are you for us or are you for our enemies? And the angel of the Lord says, to identify himself, neither. But I have come as the captain of the Lord's army. And take off your shoes where you're standing, for this is holy ground. It's another reminder for me and you as we understand this with Moses and even that with Joshua. God has not come to take our side. God has come to take over. That is a key point that you need to take out of here today, that God has come to take over. And you need to understand that He is able to take over. If you have evaluated your own life, you probably come to the point to realize there's not a whole lot that you are prepared to take over, apart from something greater than yourself. And so we see the same thing here. Moses, take off your feet, for the place you stand is holy ground. Verse 6, moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Some of you are afraid to look in God's direction. We have this idea that we know that God has a big idea. We know that God has a plan. And we continuously hear that God has His plan for my life and He has His plan for your life. And what do? We cower away from the plan. We're so scared to death that we can't dictate that plan, that we can't design that plan, that we want to keep arm's length from God. Because we just know, well, bless God, if I just surrender my life to Him, I'm headed to Africa someplace. Or if I surrender my life to Him, He's going to ask me, I've got to go stand on a street corner and I've got to tell everybody I see about Jesus. And I'm just not ready for that, and I'm not ready because I interpret what God's plan in my life, and I also interpret my inability to complete that plan, that I am ready to look away. I'm afraid if I look Him in the face, He's going to ask more of me than I'm able to produce. Verse 7. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. I know their sorrows. Do I have to remind you this morning that God knows your sorrows? There's nothing in your life that has escaped His all-watchful, all-knowing eye. That God is fully cognizant of your struggles. He's fully cognizant of your circumstances. He's fully aware of everything going on in your life and my life. And because of that, we can be assured that He cares about that. Now, that does not mean that He's going to alleviate those things. He may. But you see, because of our frailties, because of our failures, that God has to allow things to come in our life. He has to allow sorrows to come in my life and your life. I was in Russia, and Russia had just denounced communism and had become free. And we had just, several months after that, we went in with a team into Moscow. And talking to one of those pastors there. who had been in prison 5 times. Would preach at his church. They'd come and arrest him, throw him in jail for an extended period of time. He'd come out, get out, and he'd come back and he'd start preaching again. And he went through 5 incarcerations because of the Word of God, just because of his faith and being faithful. And sitting at the table with him, I said, now you're free. Isn't this great? Isn't this wonderful? Now you can go stand on the street corner if you want to. You can do anything you want to. You can share the gospel. You're free. He said, now our greatest concern, now we see the problem that we're going to have, is that in our freedom we will forget God. That we will acquire things. And because of that, we will become content. What was he saying? He was identifying that sorrows produced a razor-edge understanding, sensitivity in his life and other people's lives to keep their eyes on the God of heaven and not depend on themselves or not get caught up in the world. And because that is the place that we live. That is the gravity that we continually fight against. The world pulling at us and telling us and trying to dictate to us to come and be a part of it. God knew their sorrows. God saw what was going on, and God had a plan. And Moses was a huge part of that plan. Now, what happened in Moses' life? Well, you go back to chapter 2, and you see that how Moses has done some extraordinary things. God has done some extraordinary things in Moses' life. Preserved his life. The edict of the king was to kill the male children who were born, because there were just too many of those things happening for the children of Israel. But Moses was miraculous, not only spared, but he was placed in a position that God wanted him to be in, so that he could work in his life through that position, and also bring him to a place that Moses could use him in the life of not only Egypt, but the life of Israel itself. Moses was taught by his mother. He was in the king's court. He might have been called an Egyptian, but Moses was born and bred with the heart of Israel. His mother made sure of that. She was the one that became his caretaker. An extraordinary event in Moses' life. Moses grew up in that court. Well educated. All the trappings of the world he could have had, and as we have talked in the past, Moses laid those things down and considered the cause of Christ even greater. Moses' problem was that he decided he would try and fix it himself. So he goes out one day, he sees one of the Israelites being mistreated, and what happens? He looks this way and that way, the Bible says, and he kills the Egyptian and he buries him in the sand. He comes back the next day, he thinks he's gotten away with something, he comes back the next day, tries to break up a fight between some of his brothers, and they say, "You're going to kill us too?" And Moses says, "Uh-oh." Moses tried to make his vocation happen instead of committing himself to Christ. He knew in his heart of hearts that something needed to take place. He knew that he was in a position to do something about that for his people. And he thought, well, I'm going to go ahead, I'm just going to do something. And then when you get to chapter 3, you see Moses on the backside of Midian, tending as Jethro was father. Let me just remind you of this morning. God still is active in the ordinary. God is active in the ordinary. You see Moses doing what he's been doing again after he's fled Egypt. He's been out here for 40 years. What a mundane life this must have been for him. From the king's court to pushing sheep out in the desert. He's trying to make something happen. He has to be despondent a little bit. He said, well, I just thought, I had all this possibility in my life. And yet none of it has come to fruition. Instead, I'm on the run. I'm out here in the desert. I'm looking at the wrong end of sheep. This is life. This is what I'm called to. This is God's plan. Well, it was still God's plan. You see, Moses can think he's operating on plan B, but God still has him on plan A. In your life, you may think you have missed it. You may think you're on plan G by now. You may have come and committed your life as I had done over and over my life. I don't know how many times I came to the altar begging God, pleading with God, Lord, I know I messed up, and I just recommit my life to you. Today I'm starting all over again. And next week I would start all over again. And next week I would start all over again. There's nothing wrong with starting all over again. Some of you in here may need this morning to start all over again. But what I'm telling you is that Moses, in his life, God is still active even when he does not see that. And now, out of the ordinary, something extraordinary, once again, God is going to intersect his life. He's going to tap Moses on the shoulder, try and get his attention, because right now, instead of a flame of fire burning in his life, Moses is probably sitting in a heap of ashes thinking he's blew it. He's failed. But that's not true. And it's not true because of who his God is. And his God is still active. He still has a plan and purpose in this world and in Moses' life, and he still has the same thing no matter where you are in your life this morning. He still has the same plan and purpose that he designed for you from the foundations of the world. He hasn't changed. No matter what plan you think you're working, God is still working plan A in my life and in your life. And what does God do about that? Well, he comes alongside of us. And just like how did he tap Moses on the shore? Moses goes from the mundane to seeing the extraordinary, but there's still a possibility here that Moses can choose to go back to the sheep instead of going to the people of God and becoming their shepherd and leading them out into freedom. And so verse 2, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. If you want to see something extraordinary from God, if you want to see something happen in your life from God, you do not just observe what God is doing in the world. You don't just observe what's taking place in your life. But you come to a place of sensitivity, of seeing something, and identifying, interpreting that as God's activity in your life. Henry Blackaby, in all his writings, it comes down to this understanding. See where God is working and join him there. Moses sees the extraordinary, but the extraordinary will not show up in his life until when? When Moses says, I see it, and now I'm going to embrace it. And Moses turns aside. He says, well, maybe I need to pay attention. Maybe I need to see what's happening here, because I know something is happening. I know something is taking place. I know this is out of the ordinary. And therefore, Moses made a choice. He could have looked at that and he said, man, that is the craziest thing I've ever seen. Sheep, the water's over here. Come on, let's go. How different Moses' story would have been. How different our story can be. If we will just identify God's activity when he comes to us and speaks to us. I would like to give some clarity to that this morning. I do not have Moses here this morning, but I have Derek Pittman here this morning. Derek, if you can turn that little girl loose long enough, I want to ask you to come up here. I'll tell you what, I'm gonna make us come. I'm even gonna let you sit down. How about that? Have a seat right there. Now, if you don't know it, Derek had another burning bush event in his life yesterday. He was at the golf tournament in Atlanta when lightning struck yesterday. And thank goodness he was a couple of hundred yards away from that.
Yeah, about 200 yards away.
Yeah, but it still shook his tree. And it shook some other people's tree, and they left in ambulances. So we're glad you were able to join us today. And that really would have messed up this for me this morning, too.
I thought about that. I saw that lightning hit, and I'm like, might be the burning bush.
There it is. I heard the lightning hit, and I said, boy, I hope that boy's okay. I want him in church tomorrow. I was more concerned. If you're visiting this morning, you have no idea what's been going on in his young life and Adrian's young life and all that God has done and doing in their lives. And how long has it been now since you were there?
January 14th.
January 14th? Has it been that long?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Discovered he had kidney cancer. And so I wanted to just interview him this morning. I just didn't want him to tell his story, but I wanted to interview him to make it a part of what I'm trying to get us to understand this morning. So in that diagnosis and in your and Adrian's life at that moment in time, Adrian, stop that. I can't look at you anymore. What was it like to discover emotionally that you had cancer and realize how far it had progressed?
Long cancer. Overall, I mean, just initially there's that shock and fear, and you don't know what's going on or like how far it's progressed. When they first told me, they were like, you have a tumor that's like twice the size of your kidney. And so being a nurse, I'm like, this is not good because I just know, it could be all over. Like, I don't know what we're looking at. And so it was just super scary at first, I guess is the best way to describe it. You got like a little one, and then we find out after, about a week after diagnosis, I guess, that we had another little one on the way. So it was just a roller coaster of emotions right there at first, and I just, didn't really know what to do. You start going through all those same questions, bargaining, and figuring out what happened, and, why it's like this, and why me, and all that same stuff, and just kind of just turned to God through all that, just leaned on Him even more than I did in my normal everyday life. It just made me turn to Him more. I think that's the problem a lot of times when we're facing something like that. It's either, as Christians, we either turn closer to Him or we turn closer to the world. It's like, how are you going to be angry at God and turn toward the world, or are you going to lean more on Him? So it's kind of the decision you got to make when you're faced with stuff like that. It's pretty much only two ways to go with it.
Yep. So how did you see God in all of this? Like He'd abandoned you? Or?
Yeah, I struggled with that at first, not for too long, but the first couple of weeks, I was like, man, this is like, what's going on? And there's still that uncertainty of not knowing, is it just all over my body? Is it just confined to this one spot? So a lot of those questions, and then, like I said, I just turned more into reading my Bible more and just leaning into Him more. And, I came across the one story about, the blind man who'd been blind from birth, and he, the disciples are asking, like, is it, because I thought, like, is this my fault, or is this, like, something I did, like, why is this happening? And, in that story, Jesus healed him, and they asked, did this guy sin, or did his parents sin? It's like, no, it's nothing to do with that. It's for me to reveal my glory through him, and I think He uses stuff like this to, glorify Him. I think we're doing a disservice if we don't talk about these things that happen to us and the miracles that He does, We're kind of, you just need to tell people about it, I guess.
I guess we. Well, you've already answered the next question. How did it affect your relationship with God? So how have you grown in your relationship with God? Do you feel like it's made you more sensitive, or are you more outward focused? How has it affected your relationship with God since all this has happened?
Both. I feel way closer just on a personal level. I mean, I feel like I got this, you know, before I always knew that, but like, I feel like I just got this best friend that I can always talk to about stuff. Like, I mean, I can go and, you know, through his spirit in us, that's what reveals the word. So the more that we get into that word, the more that he reveals to us. And I think I just got deeper and deeper into it, and it was just showing me stuff. Like every time I open the Bible, you know, just seeing more stuff. It just makes you more in tune with it, I guess. I don't know how to describe it other than that.
You've done very well. What's the latest?
So we went Friday and no anything, no cancer, no.
I saw the pictures, and a lot of you saw the pictures of that, whatever that was called, X-ray or something. And I didn't have cancer. But when I saw that and saw what was going on in him, I mean, it was a shocking thing. When you see that one kidney and it's just about that big, and all of a sudden you see this mass that's about that big, and you're thinking, this may not turn out well. What we do is misidentify God's activity in our lives. We see something happen like that, and I appreciate what he said. He said, well, you begin to evaluate and you have two choices. I can go left or I can go right. I can go out in the left field, off the deep end, and I can say, well, man, if this is the way God works, if this is how God cares, if this is how God's going to touch my life, then, boy, I don't need any of this. And you see people who have an opportunity to experience God's activity, albeit a burning bush, extraordinary encounter in their lives. And they misinterpret that, or they blame God instead of letting it be something that can point them more closely to God. Listen, burning bushes are a wonderful thing, because burning bushes demonstrate God's power and remind us of God's purpose for our lives. When I thought about this, and I thought, well, Derek is a prime example of this. That God came to him with cancer. That's his burning bush. You may need to think back in your life. My burning bush was two pastors grabbing me when I was struggling with God's call on my life and trying to stay as far away from that as I could, and took me to a 3-day Bible conference up in Charlotte, North Carolina. And for 3 days, I sat under God's Word all day long, all into the evening. And that was my burning bush, because it was there that I encountered an extraordinary God who spoke loudly and clearly. And I came out of that, and I said, well, I got to go home and tell my wife. She just sold her house, and we just got rid of her business. And God said, son, you better let me handle that. And I did. And it worked out okay, and I'm still married today. God doesn't leave us or forsake us, folks. No matter what we experience, if we can take that and move out of the ordinary and move to the extraordinary and let it grip us and grab us and give our attention to this all-powerful God who has saved us and who calls us, then lives around us will benefit from that. It is ultimately not about you. It is about this extraordinary God who will indwell you and who will use you for his honor and glory. And listen, ultimately, this is about God's glory. We do not have a narcissistic God We may have someone in the White House who has a little bit of that running in his veins. But God wants to demonstrate His glory, because what happens when God demonstrates His glory? Lives are changed. People are saved. Peace comes. Circumstances change. That's what happens when God's glory shows up. And I could begin to march Phil Lister and other people across this stage who have that testimony. They can look at you and say, you know what? This happened. It was horrendous. I'm thankful for it. Best thing God could have done in my life. Because through it, instead of turning my face, I have looked into that bush and I have seen His face. And now that I have seen Him, now that I have interacted with Him, I am willing to step out with Him. Now you notice I didn't say step out myself. God does not leave Moses at the burning bush. But God is going to do something extraordinary in and through Moses' life. And you'll have to tune into the rest of the story down the road about that. So we come back to the end of the story and the big idea. God prepares and equips us for every part of His plan for our lives. We need to understand, and we need to be sensitive to God's plan at work in my life. Nothing happens to you, nothing happens to me that God has not signed off on. There are no accidents in this thing. There are no uh-ohs in this thing. It should occur to us that nothing ever occurs to God. But He is always orchestrating, He is always active in my life and your life. Our part is to try and be sensitive, to evaluate these things, these circumstances, our lives, and understand even in our ordinary, mundane, can be mundane lives, that we have an extraordinary God who's trying to intersect our lives, who's trying to get our attention, who's trying to call us to Himself, who's trying to get us, as the Hebrew says, chapter 2, verse 1, that we don't drift. We're drifters. We just need to identify God's activity in our life. God is at work, and He wants us to join Him. And there may be just one life that God wants you to intersect. God has plucked you out of the pit and plucked you out of the fire because He loves you, because He wants to redeem you like everybody else. But given you a task of that person. You may not be a Moses who gets to go redeem an entire nation. And you don't try and you do not have to try and do it yourself. Think about that. I close with this. I see the point. Moses, instead of committing himself to God, decided that he would make something happen on his own, that he would take things into his own hand, and he killed and he buried one Egyptian. But God took an entire army and buried him beneath the Red Sea, and he didn't even have to use a shovel to do it. You see, God will accomplish it if we will commit ourselves to Him and give ourselves to Him in it, which means giving myself to Him, which means looking into that burn, identifying that the bush is burning, but then looking in that bush and deciding, well, you know, I don't want to live my life sitting here in a heap of ashes. But the same God who has ignited this bush will ignite your life, and He will ignite my life. Ordinary bush. He didn't pick a big flowering whatever, just an ordinary bush. If God can do that, just think what He can do in our life. What's our part in it? We have to get in the picture. We have to put ourselves in the story. We have to embrace the plan that God's called. And He's going to point us. He's working. He's active. And He invites us to join Him. And the question is, will we join Him? Father, we thank You. your power and your presence in Moses' life, but also in our life. We think of the testimonies that we can hear of how you have intersected, how you're working our lives, and even through tough times, difficult things, hardship, that we can see your face, we can sense your presence, we can experience your peace and your grace and your mercy and your hand at work. Help us to relinquish ourselves afresh. Help us to take on the task that you've called us to. And that is simply keeping our eyes on you and following you and joining you where you decide to lead. Through deserts, dry, or through promised lands, rich and abundant. Same God, same plan. While there may be a life here that needs to be changed, speak, draw, only you can bring conviction. Help us to be willing to repent of ourselves, our sin, our selfishness, and receive you and follow you. Draw that this far away who's drifted this morning. Through this message, I pray your word is spoken, that it's not returning void even now in their lives. And I pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you stand in an attitude of prayer and worship and seeking? Ask God what He's doing in your life right now, what He wants to do. What's your part in His plan?